Fog wreathed the mountains, thick as smoke, backlit by the crimson orange of dusk. Odd as it was for the mist to swallow the landscape this late in the day, it wasn't the lack of visibility that made me doubt myself as I drove the winding interstate. I swung my car onto the exit ramp with reluctance, hesitant to commit to the misty valley. Creeping up to a spotlight which blinked a meager yellow through the fog, I trudged onto the highway and traveled towards town. The hills were silhouettes through the haze, my vehicle tracing the familiar mile through the woods with practiced precision. In that moment, I was happy for the first time in a long while. I used to love the almost mystic eeriness the mountains took on when the fog rolled in. My years chasing work further west had stolen the grim beauty of the familiar sight from me. Countless teenage nights spent driving the winding roads resurfaced in my memory, bringing a slight grin to my face. The nervousness I had felt to return home had fled. I was almost eager to see it again. The road ran through a craggy pass blasted into the mountainside, arching past steep wooded inclines and sheer barren rock, all obscured by the vapor which hung in the air. I thought of Joseph waiting on me in town, recalling nights spent wandering the hills for a quiet place to drink or smoke in the trees. Tense as the drive had been, the familiarity of the terrain put me at ease. A navigator treading a path I'd trodden 1,000 times before. It was only as I crested the craggy veiled hilltop and looked down on the town in the valley beyond that my anxieties sung once more. Morehead was large for a rural community, a brief blimp of urbanity in a sea of dark woodland. The hospital, Main Street, and university campus sprawled down the incline of the valley, the single decent residential tower looming dark and menacing through the haze like a brutalist concrete watchman. The university made it a seasonal city, its population swelling by thousands as students flooded overpriced apartments in the autumn, only to contract once more come summer. While I'd expected this muggy summer evening to be quiet, void of wandering students that haunted the winter, the quiet shadow of the valley gave me pause. There weren't, I fast realized, any other cars on the road. As I slowed, scanning my surroundings with a renewed apprehension, I noted an absence of lights from the windows and signs which should have winked back at me through the oncoming night. Even that ugly university dorm tower, which should have hosted a few lingering students even this deep into the vacation season, was lifeless and cold against the embers of the day's end. Maybe there had been a sudden storm, I reasoned, a gust or lightning strike that knocked out the power. I hadn't experienced any weather driving east, but the weather in the valley had always proven strangely unpredictable. Why, though, were there no headlights cruising the silent streets? I told myself that I'd surely miss something, a holiday or a major sporting event. It certainly wouldn't be the first time. Perhaps what few cars there were had simply been swallowed up by the fog, masked from my nervous gaze. Still, the totally vacant valley paired with the absence of light was eerie. When I hit the first intersection and realized the traffic lights were dead, the uncanny stillness grew too great for me to tolerate, and I turned off the road into the misty lot of a gas station. There were several cars alongside me in the lot, but they all seemed old and weathered. The station was dark and no movement caught my eye through the grungy windows. As I took up my phone from the empty passenger seat, I noted how cruel the past few years must have been to Moreland. The battered old husk of a station before me has laid derelict for a long time, and a few houses jutting out amidst a fog nearby looked much the same. Joseph would know what's going on, I thought, scanning the deepening darkness as if I had reason to fear it. The phone was useless, though, void of any signal. This was, I reflected, the only time I'd ever lacked a connection in Morehead, regardless of the weather. I tried a call as if my stubborn insistence would summon up cell service. It didn't. I scanned the parking lot again, finding nothing but still cars and empty pavement beyond my clouded windows. Shaking my head and forcing myself to calm down, I swung the car into motion once more, rolled out onto the road, and pressed on. Passing under the shadows of the outermost university buildings, more silhouette than solid form through the mist, I dismissed my worry as irrational. I was likely reading more into the situation than was warranted. Was this not, after all, a town that weighed heavy on my mind, especially here in the midst of the university's obscure avenues? I was decidedly not at home. I had quit years ago and headed for trade school, sickened by the sneering elitism that infested even the modest outpost coastal intellectualism. From my first days wandering the grounds, the school had seemed more devoted to spitting upon the community, which rested in its shadow of revoking thought. The contempt the institution held for the rugged country which surrounded it was soured all the more by the amount of loaned money it handed the pillagers before fleeing for saner pastures. The droning condemnations of transplanted professors from Portland or Baltimore shambled after me in memory as I turned onto a battered old avenue lined with equally battered university apartments. As they rolled past in a gloomy haze, I couldn't help but feel as if those too seemed prematurely rotten. Broken windows and stained siding marked every structure, and with my heart quickening in my chest, I realized that not one light shone from within. It was only when I swung into the aged, pothole-ridden lot of some overpriced duplex just off campus that flickering bulb at last breached the fog. It was, I fast realized, over Joseph's own porch. My car ground to a stop, but every hair on my body stood on end. I strongly considered wheeling out of the lot and speeding right back the way I had come, blowing past the camps and right out of Morehead. Though I had no reason to feel directly threatened, I felt more and more as if I had stumbled upon an empty film set in the mountains, a moldering Potemkin village I was not meant to explore. The whole atmosphere of the valley was off, and I could no longer convince myself that it was my own hang-ups keeping me flustered. That lone porch light was the worst of it, a glinting bauble upon an empty sea of drifting vapor. Even as I scanned my surroundings and found them once more void of life, a single word came to the fore of my mind. I lunged for my phone again, reasoning just enough to attempt a call one final time. Again, void of signal. Thwarted. Everything had been just placid and normal enough to make me second-guess myself, staying just shy of uncanny. Now, there I sat in surroundings that were simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar. Feeling stranded, as my eyes rose, I lurched, startled at the presence of a figure on the porch. When I saw the face, wide-eyed and pale in the cruel gleam of the headlights, my fears were momentarily overcome by empathy. It was Joseph. Stunned, as if I were an apparition from a bad dream, I slid from my car, raising a hand in greeting, unsure what to say. His eyes narrowed, more confused than angry. "Why are you here?" My own eyes narrowed in turn. "I drove out here to help you move tomorrow, asshole." I retorted, trying to keep the vibe good-natured. Joseph looked almost confused, disarmed by my simple words. He nodded, but it was an absent gesture, uncertain and strained. The words had yet to leave my mouth when a distant bellow echoed down from the barely visible ridge of low wooded mountains to the east. If I say it was like a wheezing deer vocalization, that wouldn't be far off the mark, but it was far deeper, shattering the silence of the valley. It sounded as if the lungs of the size of a truck had made that noise, and a gravelly undercurrent ran beneath it, like concrete being scraped against stone. "We've got to go," Joseph told me, motioning towards the car. "You have enough gas to get out of here?" "What's going on?" I asked the question as I ducked back into my car. Joseph quick to slide into his familiar spot in the passenger seat. It had been many years since I'd seen him in person, but he was a parlor-stricken shadow now, much like the rotten town all around me. He was hardly recognizable as the friend I'd survived high school with. "Just drive," Joseph said, his eyes scanning the pale vapors shrouding the southern hills. I did as he said, more uncomfortable than I'd been before my friend stumbled into the picture. I waited, seeing if he'd begin an explanation in his own time. Fortunately for me, the icy silence was broken not long after I turned back into the shadows of the university campus. "How did you make it in?" "I drove in. Came in from I-64, as always." Joseph seemed to mull over that, his eyes never leaving the distant hills through the windows. "We need to take another way out," Joseph told me, nodding to himself. "Nothing gets out through the pass." I was taken aback by the odd, ominous statement, but let it hang in the air. I couldn't think of a protest that didn't sound petulant and panicky. "There's something on the hills," Joseph explained, finally looking at me from across the way. "Came in with the fog. Comes down into the valley at night. I'm surprised it let you slip past." I shook my head, protesting. "Comes down at night? How long has this been going on?" Somehow, our surreal surroundings made Joseph's vague suggestion of something on the hills the least befuddling part of his explanation. I was more concerned with the vacant, shell-shocked look he sported. The town around us looked like decades had passed in a hushed neglect. The buildings rotting like oceanfront shanties, harassed by the salty wind, and Joseph was no different, drawn and haggard. "I don't know," Joseph said after a long, vacant pause. "A long time. The days are short, the nights are long. The fog makes it hard to tell which is which." "I talked with you just this afternoon," I protested, "just 4 hours back." Joseph looked confused, pensive, as if attempting to recover memories from remotest childhood. He didn't answer, but I didn't press him. None of this made sense. It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make matters any better if I tried to force Joseph to make sense of them. Instead, I tried to distract the both of us with the task at hand. "Which direction?" Joseph took a moment to consider my question, looking every which way at the intersection we'd come to. Night had settled in now, and the world outside was more vague and foreboding. He nodded south, and I took the turn, silently happy we'd avoided the claustrophobic winding road that led east through the mountains toward Olive Hill and that strange, rumbling sound. I focused on the road. Out past Clearfield, then. Yeah, Joseph said. It was a dark road, with only sparse settlements scattered along its length. But it was well maintained. There were broad sweeps of cleared vegetation to the sides of the highway, and you could easily chew through the miles at a fast pace. This should have comforted me, but the silence in the car was deafening, and I found myself more and more certain I was making a mistake as I moved along the road. Desperate to alleviate the still hush, I waved vaguely to the mist closing in around the car, asking, "How big an area is infected, do you think?" "I don't know," Joseph said. "I think I know a way out, though." He let the words fall off at that. I was on the verge of pressing him for more information when he leaned over me and jammed a finger at the driver's side window. An old, winding lodging road, half eaten by wandering weeds, crept up the mountainside here. It was more by memory that I knew this, for its muddy, tree-lined mouth was all that could be seen in the softly drifting haze. "There," Joseph said. "We crossed there." I looked from Joseph to the gravel trail's shadowy entrance. I shook my head, protesting. "We have no idea how bad that road is. The car will get stuck halfway up. Then we'll be walking out." Joseph leaned back, insisting, "That's the only way out." "How would you know that?" There was another wheezing bellow from the other side of the road, opposite the lodging path. It was distant, but far closer than before. "Move," Joseph ordered. My eyes met Joseph's, then, wide in the gloom of the car, for the first time, I was taking a good look at him, up close in the shade. I could have sworn that, in that ambient glow of the headlights, there was something off about them. Something misshapen. Even now, removed from the frenzied rush of the nervous night, I can't shake the feeling that the pupils were elongated. For one tense span of a second, scored by another wheezing snort from the unseen caller in the trees, I saw goatish, oblong pupils glaring back. Time seemed to freeze. I had the clarity to retrace my steps, to picture that lone porch light in the sea of dark decay. I'd been so desperate for company in that foreboding town, so relieved to see a familiar face. Too relieved. I made to swing the car around, to turn back the way I'd come in hope I wasn't too late. I expected a fight, some sort of grapple over the gear shift, but it never came. I looked up to find Joseph gone. The other seat was empty, the car soundless and still once more. The road beyond the window was not empty, however. As I righted the car and prepared to step on the gas, something pushed through the trees beside the lodging road, snarled and glooming. Shambling on stick-thin limbs, a giant caricature of a human being stumbled through the fog. From its vague outline, antler-like growth sprouted in haphazard clusters from glistening flesh. Its obscured hands were outstretched, reaching for the car, the jagged claws branch-like and stiff. The old car's whining engine protested as I forced it into motion, but it moved all the same. As I turned back to the road, I saw more of the shambling forms, both large and small, stumble from the opposite hill. My darting eyes, catching movement in the rearview mirror, took in dozens of them in the mist, each awkward movement a jerking struggle. There was a loud scraping, as of branches across a car roof, as I picked up speed. Something clattered against the rear bumper of the car. Then, as quickly as they came, the shapes were lost in the nocturnal haze behind me, and I was left alone with my racing, tortured thoughts on the road. Morehead was alive with twisted life when I reached it. Those awful wheezing calls echoed through the empty streets. Spindly figures darted along alleys and across rooftops. I kept my eyes forward, heart thumping, moving as fast as I dared in the tired old vehicle, retracing my steps towards the interstate. As I climbed the hill towards the valley's edge, a keening snort-like wind through a tunnel rippled across the small city. I threw a foolish, desperate final look at the mirror. Atop the southern slopes, there was a monolith against the horizon, an impossibly towering tree amongst the forest. That's what I would have taken it to be, on a sane night anyway. The spinny, ragged form raised a gigantic, spindly limb and waved. The fog broke upon the ridges as I passed out the valley. The lights along the interstate came into view, and for a long moment I questioned my sanity. A truck rumbled across the overpass, and in a rush of exhausted fervor, I sped onto I-64 and rocketed west, far away from the broadening hills at my back. Some 10 miles out of Morehead, I heard a rumbling in the passenger seat, a text from Joseph. A glance told me. I waited until I reached Lexington, nearly an hour later, before picking up the phone. The messages were entirely mundane. Joseph asked whether I'd be on time and said he'd keep the food in the fridge in case I came in late. Sitting in a well-lit lot on the outskirts of Lexington, I tried to convince myself I'd had some vivid, sleep-deprived half-dream in the hills. I tried to believe that my stress had gotten the better of me. I even succeeded for a time. Still, I could not convince myself to return to Morehead. I came up with a meager excuse, left the probably sleeping Joseph a message explaining myself, and drove for home. I was in no condition to be with company, I thought. Better to rest in familiar surroundings and try to get a grip on whatever hallucinatory episode I'd had in the mountains. I was able to keep a grip on this comforting fiction until I stopped for gas another hour into the drive. I've never returned to Moreland. Joseph talks sporadically with me, as do my other friends in town, and none of them have ever mentioned anything odd. I've never worked up the nerve to ask either, still mortified at the thought of broaching that miswreathed nightmare with anyone familiar. Despite things seeming to have continued as normal for friends and family in the region, I've never been able to escape the icy grip that fell upon me when I saw the roof of my car in the wake of that harrowing night's drive. In the sickly glow of the gas station's overheads, the dull gleam of metal caught my eye across the top of the car and twisted parody of gigantic fingernails. 4 deep gouges had carved their ragged way through the paint.